Member for Gellibrand. I give the call to the member for Ryan.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. What an indictment of our society that in this day and age, with more than 2,000 years of so-called civilisation, that this issue is so rife. 2 deaths a week, not in some violent country on the other side of the world, but here in Australia. It is definitely time to do something. Domestic violence betrays trust, destroys families and leaves long-lasting emotional and physical scars, not only for the victim but for those around them. Domestic violence in any form is unacceptable and is incumbent upon all of us to work effectively to eradicate it. This coalition government has placed domestic violence prominently on the national agenda in cooperation with state and territory governments, and in this regard I would like to place on record my strong support for the Prime Minister's recent announcement that domestic violence will be listed as a priority for the coalition of Australian governments in 2015. The governments will focus on implementing a national domestic violence order scheme, developing national outcome standards for perpetrator interventions and improving online safety for women. These measures are crucial in keeping families safe from these wicked and violent acts. I would also note the work of the former Queensland Government in commissioning a task force into domestic violence and the receipt of the task force report titled "Not Now, Not Ever, Putting an End to Domestic and Family Violence in Queensland," which was commissioned by then Premier Campbell Newman. The report found that on average there are 180 instances of domestic violence every day in Queensland, and that between 2011-12 and 2013-14 reports of domestic violence increased from 58,000 to 66,000. The report makes 140 recommendations, and I trust the new Queensland Government will study these carefully with a view to continuing the good work initiated by the former government. And I place on record my appreciation to the Task Force Chairman, Governor-General Quentin Bryce. Mr Deputy Speaker, domestic violence in all its forms is a blight on our country. It is unacceptable. We must take time to consider that domestic violence comes in all shapes and sizes, and the shapes and sizes are not always what we expect. We must be wary of falling into the path of only believing those who we typically expect to be victims. We must train our emergency service staff, social workers, doctors, teachers and others to look out for unlikely victims, the ones who keep quiet and suffer in silence. Perpetrators of violence all start somewhere. Schoolyard bullies are not always the big kids. Often it is the reverse. Not all victims of domestic violence are poor or uneducated. Not all perpetrators are the physically strong attacking the physically weak. Not all domestic violence involves a black eye or visible signs of abuse. Mental torture can be as damaging and sometimes has long-lasting impacts, but never heals. Not all domestic violence is perpetrated by strong men on vulnerable women. The only way to eradicate all forms of domestic violence from our culture is to put aside our preconceived ideas and to look at every victim as an individual, not as a stereotype. We must give victims of violence the courage to speak out without the fear of ridicule or disbelief. Most importantly, we must say to the victims, "I believe you." Mr Deputy Speaker, the mover of this motion also mentioned our near neighbours in Papua New Guinea, where you're more likely to have gender-based violence than otherwise. And I would like to recognise the work of Dalala Gore, the current minister, who I know, Mr Deputy Speaker, you met with on recent trips, and Governor Julie Sosa Akiki up in Goroka, who are working so hard on trying to resolve the issues in that country. People like the Lineata Legacy and Sister Lorraine in Bougainville. The issues up there are even more stark than the ones we have here. And, Mr Deputy Speaker, I would say that this is an issue that cannot be resolved by governments, by talking, by coming up with protocols. This is an issue that we all must take responsibility for, person by person, house by house, street by street. We must all take responsibility and stand up and be heard. And I commend Air Vice Marshal Mark Binskin, who my colleague, the member for Mallee, quoted, who said, "The standard you walk past is the situation you accept." We must give victims the confidence to come forward and speak up, and when they do, we must believe them.